Shabbat Shalom, and early Hanukkah Sameach as we commence the Festival of Lights, or more accurately, the Festival of Dedication this Sunday at sundown. I just pray that everyone would be blessed by the season and that we might all commit ourselves to rededicating our hearts to Hashem, to the Lord in this season, as we celebrate the historic events of the rededication of the altar in the temple many years ago. And we just my prayer would be that everybody would be blessed this season. Vina Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we thank you for this night. We thank you for this divine appointment of the Shabbat. We thank you for blessing us, enabling us to reach this season, and Lord, for joining us each week in a special way, a way that transcends even your presence, which is with us always. We just pray, Lord, tonight that your Ruach, your Spirit, might give us all a special revelation, even from this very simple story of Yosef, which we will talk about briefly tonight and read about in the weeks to follow. We just pray that, above all, we might have our eyes opened to the message of Messiah in this very parasha, in this very story, in this very narrative, Lord, that in addition to strengthening our faith, we might be better equipped, Lord, to make well known your presence throughout the whole Torah, Lord, that has been revealed in a very powerful way through our Messiah. And just pray, Lord, tonight that be with us and help us to comprehend this story and special aspects of it that might be just a flavorful revelation for us this year and might be able to build upon in years to come. We just praise you and worship you in the name of Yeshua. Amen. So this Shabbat we conclude, or rather we conclude our study of Parashat Vayeshev, which is the Torah portion which covers Bereshit 37 verse 1 through 40 verse 23. And this week's portion is very special because it initiates the story of Yaakov's beloved son Yosef, which through analysis frames the backdrop for the prophetic destiny of Messiah Yeshua himself, the future suffering that he would undergo, and the subsequent exaltation. As I've often pointed out in years past and during various times during Sukkot, and also once or twice as we've observed Shavuot here, the story of Yosef that begins in this portion in many ways foreshadows Yeshua and his fulfillment of the Tanakh's prophecies, the Messianic prophecies regarding Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah son of Joseph, the suffering servant. I believe that's what makes this portion and the one that follows it very important. So this narrative, properly understood and recapitulated along with its messianic emphasis, should serve to strengthen our belief in the Besorah b'Mashiach, the good news of Messiah, as well as to provide us a compelling insight from the Torah itself that is useful to those who may be considering the message of Messiah. For those who are doing so, it is likely they will find Yeshua to be the Messiah spoken about by Moshe in the Torah. Messiah Yeshua himself says in John chapter 5 verse 46, "If you were believing in Moses, you would believe in me, because he wrote about me." As we begin to examine this portion, the first thing we can see about our Messiah comes when we take note of the names of this portion and the two that led up to it. 2 weeks ago, we concluded Parashat Vayetze, meaning he went out. Last week, Parashat Vayishlach, meaning he sent. And this week, we conclude Parashat Vayeshev, meaning he settled. He went out, he sent, he settled. Together, these three portions form a prophetic picture of the redemption process that is actively being fulfilled by Messiah, Yeshua, as we await its completion at his second coming. Comprising the more predominant elements of the good news of Messiah, we see this redemption process. He went out, he sent, and he settled, demonstrated by Yeshua's going out from the Father, his sending forth of his Talmidim, his disciples, and his settling at the right hand of the Father after conquering death. But ultimately, we will see the last part of this prophetic picture fulfilled when he settles permanently among his people, as we read in Revelation 21, verse 3. I also heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God is among men, and he shall tabernacle among them. They shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them and be their God. You see, when we contemplate the events of the Torah in continuation and in context, contained within this story about God's relationship with his people Israel, we're able to expound on God's plan of redemption for all of humanity. Through this framework, Israel serves as a microcosm of the whole world. The manner in which the Tanakh describes God's redemption of Israel from slavery and subsequent ascension to the Promised Land illuminates his plan to redeem all those who put their faith in him from the slavery of sin and ascension to glorification at his return. And it is no mistake that he's orchestrated the scriptures in this manner. Throughout the Brit Chadashah, we are often exhorted as believers to be eagerly awaiting the promised redemption and all that it entails. We read in Romans 8, verses 23 through 25, We ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Ruach, groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for adoption, the redemption of our body. For in hope we are saved. But hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. And this is of utmost importance, because we are frequently reminded that our ability to endure the trials and tribulations of this world, as well as our capacity to accomplish the purpose God has for our lives as individuals, is largely dependent on how focused we are on the promise of his coming and our eternal destiny in the Olam Haba, the world to come. That is why Rab Shaul tells us in 2 Corinthians 4 that our trouble, light and momentary, is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, as we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. But waiting with anticipation does not mean that we sit around and do nothing, believing that Mashiach is going to come back and welcome us with open arms into his kingdom. We are warned not to be given over to this sentiment by the Master himself in his parable regarding the servants who were entrusted with talents that they were expected to multiply for his purposes. We recall that the two servants were faithful in laboring for the sake of bringing their master fortune, but the one who thought it was acceptable to merely present to the master what he was first given learned a troubling lesson when he was told in Matthew 25, verses 26 through 29, But his master responded, You wicked, lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you should have brought my money to the brokers, and when I came, I would have received it back with interest. Therefore take the talent away from him, and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For the one who has, more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. This mashal, this parable, leads us into the next lesson that can be learned when we examine the names of these three Torah portions. All three of these portions' names are active verbs, expressing the desire of God that we as followers of Messiah Yeshua demonstrate our faith in him by actions and not merely words. As we read in James chapter 1, verse 22, But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves. And again in Romans 2, verse 13, where Rab Shaul, Paul the Apostle, tells us, For it is not the hearers of the Torah who are righteous before God, rather it is the doers of the Torah who will be justified. And with this in mind, we must take notice of the apparent difference between the name of our portion from this week and that of the last 2 weeks. As opposed to Vayetze and Vayishlach, where the actions he went out and he sent hold the connotation of moving forward, we see in this week's portion, Vayeshev, the action holds the connotation of actively settling down. We read in the first verse of the portion, Genesis 37, verse 1, Now Jacob checked into a retirement home and settled in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. I'm paraphrasing a little. But we observe that Jacob decides to settle down where his fathers had endlessly sojourned. Here we see that perhaps Jacob had come to a point in his life when he believed that his work was done. He had finished having children. He had lost his beloved wife Rachel. He reached the land of Canaan, which was promised to him through his forefathers, namely Abraham. And now he wanted to kick back, relax, and enjoy the last few years of his life. And we can't blame him, as we sometimes all feel this way. But as tempting as this notion can be, we cannot let the momentary stops in life, when things are going well and we're reflecting on the goodness of God, to become a perpetual ceasing from the work that we have for the Lord. In Ephesians 5 verse 16, Paul tells us to make the most of your time because the days are evil. And he tells us this with good reason, because when we begin to live our life without full cognizance and commitment to the calling that God has for us all as his emissaries, the enemy Hasatan will use the opportunity to seek to lull us to sleep until we find ourselves living lives that are devoid of purpose and filled with temporal rewards that have no real intrinsic value. This often leads to disaster. Parenthetically, this was the cause of Jacob's suffering, the pain of believing that he had lost his son Joseph, tragically to a wild beast. This phenomenon of settling down in the present world can be allegorically viewed as a spiritual calm before the storm, because it is precisely after we have settled down and become complacent that we can be given over to spiritual downfall. In the Torah, we witness this many times over. We witness this phenomenon realized many times with the Torah, one being in Genesis chapter 33, when Jacob bought land and became content to settle in Shechem, in harmony with the idol worshippers who dwelt there. The inevitable curiosity and desire of his daughter to seek out the women of the city resulted in her tragic rape and the subsequent mass murder carried out by his sons, Simeon and Levi. Upon their departure from the city, it was realized that they too had adopted the idols of the peoples of the city and adorned themselves in apparel in like manner to them. Another example of this phenomenon occurs after the Exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites believed that Moses would not be descending anytime soon from Mount Sinai. They fell victim to the worship of the golden calf. We discovered that the demeanor resulting in this act of idolatry was one of indulgence and perceived bliss. As we read in Exodus 32 verse 6, they rose up early the next morning, sacrificed burnt offerings, and brought fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to make merry. Messiah Yeshua himself warns that this will be the state of the world when it is at the peak of idolatry, directly preceding his return, when he says in Matthew chapter 24 verses 37 to 39, "For just as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and swept them all away. So shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man." But we are encouraged by Paul in Ephesians 5:14 to wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Messiah will shine on you. Returning to our portion, we see the result of Jacob settling this time would be the unfortunate betrayal of his beloved son Joseph by his brothers, resulting in the salvation of his family, foreshadowing the suffering and subsequent exaltation of Messiah Yeshua that would lead to the salvation of the whole world. We catch a glimpse of this transition in status when we examine the description of Joseph in verse 2 of our portion, which says, "When Joseph was 17 years old, he was a youth. He was shepherding the flocks with his brothers, with the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father." In the same sentence, Joseph is indicated as 17 years old, and oddly, he's referred to as a na'ar, meaning youth, but more commonly translated lad or boy. And he is also chaya ro'eh et chayu, meaning, it can be literally translated, a shepherd of his brothers. Here Joseph is described in his current state of a young boy of 17 years of age, but simultaneously in his future status as a shepherd of his family. The narrative here of a young boy with prophetic dreams of heavenly wisdom, who would shepherd his family, corresponds perfectly with the one we follow in the Good News, where Messiah Yeshua is described as a wise young child in Luke chapter 2, verse 40, which records, "The child kept growing and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." And just 18 years later, Yeshua would reveal himself as the great shepherd in John chapter 10, verse 11, when he says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." In keeping with this theme, we see the similarities between Joseph and Messiah Yeshua continue when we read in verse 3 that Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. So he had made him a long-sleeved tunic. Here the father of Joseph loved him and exalted him by clothing him with a ketonet, which is the same term used for the high priest's outer garment described in Exodus 28, verse 4. And in Matthew 3, verse 16 through 17, we see our Heavenly Father clothe His Son, Yeshua, with the Ruach HaKodesh, as He testifies, "This is my Son, whom I love. With Him I am well pleased." And to no surprise, like the Pharisees of Yeshua's time, Joseph's brothers became jealous of him, spurring on their anger and eventually culminating in their plot to kill him. Continuing in the portion, we witness the hatred of Joseph's brothers growing stronger as he shares the first of two dreams he would have with them. In his dream, he is binding sheaves with his brothers, and his sheaf stands upright as theirs fall before his. The meaning of the dream is conveyed as indicating that Joseph will rule over his brothers. Upon hearing about the dream, the brothers respond to Joseph indignantly, saying, "Will you truly be a king over us?" His brothers said to him, "Will you really rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and because of his words. In Joseph's second dream, he sees the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. When sharing this dream with his family, his father rebukes him for suggesting that he and his mother would bow to him. But we read that he did not discount the dream altogether, but rather he guarded the words according to verse 11. We recall a similar event in Luke 2, verse 46, in the life of young Yeshua, when he remained in Jerusalem after his earthly guardians had departed from the feast of Passover. After searching for him for 3 days, worriedly, they found him in the temple studying the Torah. When he offered them a somewhat obscure explanation, telling them that he was doing what God had appointed him to do, though perturbed and not understanding what he meant, his mother Miriam treasured the words in her heart. Sometime after these events would come a day, however, when God's plan for Joseph's exaltation would begin. But as is often the case in keeping with the expression, before things would be getting better for Joseph, they would be getting a lot worse. In Genesis 37, verses 12 through 13, we read, "Then his brothers went to graze their father's flocks at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, 'Aren't your brothers grazing the flocks in Shechem? Come, let me send them to you.' 'Hineni, here am I,' he said to him." In obedience to his father, Joseph sets out to come to his brothers. But as we read on, we find that when they saw him from afar, they conspired to kill him, demonstrating the same phenomenon experienced by Yeshua as is written in John chapter 11, or 1 verse 11, which says, "He came to his own, but his own did not receive him." We discovered that the plan to kill Joseph was secondarily a means to test the validity of his dreams, when they say in verse 20, "Come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those pits, so we can say that an evil animal devoured him. Then let's see what becomes of his dreams." Again, in like manner, we see that there were individuals who used the execution stake as a testing ground for the testimony of Yeshua, as we read in Matthew 27, verse 42. "He saved others," they were saying, "but he can't save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the stake, and then we'll believe in him." But concluding this chapter of the Torah portion, we approach probably the most glaring of paralleled events between the story of Joseph and that of Yeshua. The chapter concludes with the brothers' decision to sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver at the behest of Judah, and to strip him of his tunic as evidence that he had died. They then send the tunic to his father, convincing him that his son had died and causing him to feel as though he had been separated from his son forever. As we read tonight in the New Covenant portion, Yeshua was also betrayed by Judah for 30 pieces of silver. After he was clothed in a fine tunic and mocked by the Roman soldiers, we read in Matthew 27, verse 31, when they finished mocking him, they stripped the robe off him and put his own clothes back on him, and they led him away to crucify him. And just as Jacob felt estranged from his son Joseph, whom he believed to be dead, Yeshua expresses a sense of estrangement from his father when he exclaims, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? But would Joseph ever be reunited with his father? You'll have to tune in next week to find out. But I'll give you a hint. Just like all these other parallels we've been looking at, if you follow the story of Joseph, or of Yeshua rather, you'll know what to expect. And that concludes the first chapter of the Parsha. The portion now takes a break from the main narrative for a seemingly disconnected story concerning Judah and a portion of his life which was spent away from his primary family. At first glance, this part of the Parsha, this story, does not seem to fit. It seems completely disconnected in various ways, and so we must question, why is it here and what is it here to teach us? In this story we read that Judah would be married to the daughter of this mysterious character, Shua. And with her he would have 3 sons. The oldest of his sons would suffer death by the hand of God because he was evil. And as a result, his wife Tamar would be given to his younger brother in order to produce offspring for him. However, we see that his brother would sabotage every attempt to reproduce offspring for his brother, and as a result, God took his life as well. Out of fear of losing his last and final son, Judah tells Tamar to return to her father's house until his youngest son grows up, and then be married to him. But he is unfaithful to her and does not give his son to her once he has grown. The climax of this story occurs when Tamar successfully disguises herself as a prostitute in order to consort with Judah and bear children by him, the descendants of whom would be King David and the Messiah according to the flesh. And the story concludes with Tamar revealing to Judah what he had done unknowingly, and his public confession that he had been unfaithful to her by withholding his son. This is an interesting story that often challenges us with hard-to-answer questions regarding the morality of Tamar and her plan that from every angle appears to have had Adonai's providential intervention. The story holds great messianic significance because we know that Messiah must come from Judah, and this story reveals the son through whom Messiah would come, Peretz. But when we take a closer look at the story, we see a deeper lesson here, one that when acknowledged reveals how it is connected to the greater narrative of Joseph. Up to this point, it seems as if Judah has not been able to clearly see how his actions have affected those around him. And if he hasn't exhibited any remorse for those actions. After all, it was his idea to sell his brother Joseph, and in this story, he was content with allowing Tamar to remain a widow. But like the great father that he is, Adonai disciplines Judah in a way that would bring him to a true recognition of his sin, resulting in a genuine confession. At the end of this account, when Tamar would present the 3 items Judah gave her for a pledge of payment for their encounter, the Lord would have her use some very important words in doing so. In Genesis 38, verse 25, she says to him, I am pregnant by the man to whom these belong. Then she said, do you recognize whose these are? The seal, the cords, and the staff. By asking Judah to identify the items, he would be condemned in the same manner that he and his brothers wronged their father Jacob when they asked him to identify Joseph's tunic in order to deceive him into believing his son was dead. We see this method of discipline employed against Abraham when he makes the mistake of procreating with the Egyptian handmaid Hagar at the request of his wife Sarah. Later, when Sarah suggests that he send away his beloved son Ishmael, God tells Abraham to listen to her voice. These examples serve as a reminder to us that the circumstances of our life often function as mirrors, showing us our own iniquities. And through discernment and reflection, we should seek to make a teshuvah, make a repentance, and turn back to God while little discipline is necessary. However, when we choose not to practice this discernment, we are reminded that just as Judah was condemned by his own words, we too will be held accountable for ours. Messiah warns us of this in Matthew 12, verse 36 to 37, when he says, "But I tell you that on that day of judgment, men will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, but by your words you will be condemned." In the last leg of the portion, Joseph begins to thrive in his position of servant for the prominent Egyptian who trusts him with everything he has. God gives great favor to Joseph, and all is well, until the wife of his master determines to entice him to lay with her. Joseph remains faithful, however, to God and ends up falsely being accused of making advances on her one day when he comes to work and she alone is left in the house. This situation results in him being in prison, where once again God helps him to gain the trust of the prison ward and leadership over all the inmates. The portion concludes with Joseph interpreting the dreams of two prisoners who share the details of their slumbers with him. Joseph asks the prisoners to whom he gave a positive interpretation to remember him when he is restored to his former position as cupbearer of Pharaoh. Yet when the interpretation is fulfilled, the cupbearer forgets Joseph and he remains imprisoned for the time being. I hope the overwhelming pictures presented throughout these portions will resonate in our souls as we are strengthened in our faith of Yeshua, that he is indeed the one who was spoken of by Moses. We pointed to several of those pictures tonight, but twice as much time could not amount to what was needed to look at every parallel that we see throughout particularly this story, but also throughout the Torah. As we continue through this story in the upcoming week, may the Lord give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to understand, that we might all increase in understanding and fulfillment of good deeds in Messiah Yeshua. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.